The CMO Confidential podcast is a proud member of the I Hear Everything podcast network. Looking to launch or scale your podcast? I Hear Everything delivers podcast production, growth, and monetization solutions that transform your words into profit. Ready to give your brand a voice? Then visit iheareverything.com.
Welcome to CMO Confidential, the podcast that takes you inside the drama, decisions, and choices that go with being the head of marketing. Hosted by five-time CMO Mike Linton.
Marketers have been working on personalization since the dawn of the internet, and actually even earlier than that. Now with AI, you can deliver ads made for each of your customers. Publicis Sapient is committed to faster, better personalization and is proud to introduce Slingshot and Bodhi AI. Now, these AI platforms are designed to customize every key touch point and reduce creative timelines from weeks to days. With Publicis Sapient, marketing isn't just fast, it's personal. Smarter marketing, happier teams, wow-worthy customer moments. Upgrade your marketing at publicissapient.com. Welcome, marketers, advertisers, and those who love them to Chief Marketing Officer Confidential. CMO Confidential is a program that takes you inside the drama, the decisions, and the politics that go with being the head of marketing at any company in what is one of the most scrutinized jobs in the executive suite. I'm Mike Linton, the former Chief Marketing Officer of Best Buy, eBay, Farmers Insurance, and Ancestry.com, here today with my guest, Dr. Eugene Soltes. Today's topic, managing the gray area, the fine line between marketing and lying. Now, Eugene is a professor at the Harvard Business School where he has been teaching for nearly 16 years. He also authored a book titled Why They Do It, and here it is. It's inside the mind of the white collar criminal. Now, I picked up this book and I couldn't put it down, finished it in less than 3 days. And we thought it'd be great to hear what Eugene has to say about marketers who often find themselves in the gray space. And he has graciously accepted our invitation to join the show. Welcome, Eugene.
Thanks, Mike. Real pleasure to have a chance to join you and discuss an interesting topic. I won't say a fun one, especially if you're on the other side here.
It's fun to read about, though. It's probably not so interesting to be involved in your book, but fun to read about it. Before we even go into the topic, ground our listeners in what you teach and the book you wrote. Just give us a writ large overview of the whole space of this whole white collar crime thing.
Yeah, I mean, any of us that reads like the newspaper, we see these giant cases on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and I think we're curious, what happened? How did you get there? We read most recently, the Theranos, the FTX, these huge cases. It's 16, 17 years ago at this point. I had that same question, and I maybe went one step further than most people do. It's pure personal curiosity. I just started writing some of the people whose cases I'd been following the news, asked to speak with them. Turns out when you're a former executive that's now incarcerated, you have a bit more time on your hands, and several were gracious enough to make themselves available to become pen pals or literally meet them in prison. And that's what started my, I'll say, journey into this whole area.
So I just want to make sure I hear this right. While other people were immersing themselves in, say, fantasy football or something else, you decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write Bernie Madoff a letter and have a chat with him. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that much more thought out. I was actually watching a TV show at like 3 a.m. while I was actually finishing my graduate school degree and running some regressions, and frankly was flipping through the TV channels and was inspired by this called Lockup, this cross between a reality TV show and a documentary. And watching that show where they're interviewing people that are generally convicted felons of generally in a medium security prison, I was saying, hey, the guys that I've been following, people from Enron and WorldCom, soon enough Bernie Madoff. How did they get there? They didn't come from gangs or broken homes, drugs. They had these amazing backgrounds. What happened? And so, yeah, that was just my curiosity got the best of me, you could say, to start this journey off.
And so this becomes a something you decide to teach. How do you even think about structuring it and then teaching it?
Yeah, well, I should be very careful because oftentimes I'm introduced and it says Eugene teaches white collar crime, and so I want to be very clear. I don't teach white collar crime. In fact, most of the work that I do now is how we try to prevent such things from occurring. But I think to understand how to prevent it from occurring in the future, we need to first understand how it occurs. So we want to get into the mindset of people who engage in these offenses. And I will say, by and large, the people in my book, they're thoughtful, reasonable, strategic people that made a series of errors. And that's what led them down to the slippery slope that ultimately had these extraordinary consequences. But I mean, the preface in the second edition of the book was called Why We Do It, because we're all susceptible to the certain kinds of biases and pressure that can lead us down this path. So really what I'm focused on with our participants in our exec ed programs and our students in our MBA programs is trying to understand, like, how do people succumb to these environments that ultimately lead to these extraordinary ramifications, and why don't they see it earlier and manage to stop before it upsets both everything that they've built, their companies, and obviously the huge externalities this has on investors and other stakeholders.
And so before we even get into the root of this interview, like, what is the structure of that kind of class, like, or that kind of like teaching? Because what I hear you saying is almost anybody can fall down this road if you don't have a little bit of awareness, sturdiness or whatever. The temptation is sitting there almost all the time. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. I think well put. I taught an MBA class called Borderline. It's exactly what you think it is. It's about conduct that's somewhere in the gray zone between moral, immoral, legal, illegal. And I think what surprised many of the students that took the class is several people were prominent executives who made some pretty serious errors that led them to be in the headlines for a very different reason than they expected. And I think a lot of people have the sense that, like, I'm the good apple. These people we read about that are executives that fall from grace are bad apples, and they're going to seem really sinister. And it turns out when they come to class and spend some time, they don't look very different from most of the current executives that we have as they talk about, the challenges and stresses that they have. And I think that's pretty humbling and actually pretty scary to most people, because you realize you can't actually differentiate it like everyone would like to think they can.
And you could be, the other thing I took away from the book is you could be in a situation where there is pressure on you to cut the corner or take a step. It could be personal, it could be your company, it could be the industry. And sometimes it's easy to take that first step. Is that fair?
At Publicis Sapient, we're not just talking about AI. We're delivering real results today. With Sapient AI, we speed up software development and save clients thousands of hours. We revolutionize how travelers discover their perfect getaway. And even turn a simple fridge scan into a personalized meal plan. Making AI work for you? It's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people in the book actually said, we all think we know when that big ethical consequential decision will come and we'll make the right decision. But I didn't see the decision when it was in front of me, because a lot of time it's one of the 100 other decisions you're making. People are giving you similar feedback and advice. So you kind of lull yourself into these decisions that sometimes have these extraordinary ramifications. Oftentimes, as I know we're going to get into probably, the line between, I will say, where there's potentially a lot of value created and a lot of money to be had, and it will be celebrated and rewarded, and then the other side of the line, which could send you to prison. Oftentimes that is a very fine, it's not even a line, it's a gray zone, and people operate in that gray zone actually oftentimes quite a bit of the time, and that's murky.
Well, let's talk about some of those gray zones.
Yeah.
You know, we talked in our pre-call about regulatory arbitrage. Let's talk about regulatory arbitrage and then go into a case study about that.
Yeah, this is how tech operates. A lot of tech, and it's innovative. It's where there's a regulation that someone will say it's either outdated, it's simply the regulation hasn't been created in the right way to benefit consumers, and so you ignore the law initially, and then you hope you get a large enough following that what you're doing is not illegal. And if one looks at the kind of the origins of Uber, Airbnb, businesses we celebrate today, I mean, the effective origins of their business would not pass, I will say, let's say, clear muster of what the prevailing law at the time. But the idea is you build a base, you have millions of customers, and the laws will adjust and change. It's what crypto is actually, you can see, arguing now. But in the process, there were a lot of crypto people that have gone to prison, that have paid some very large fines. Some of them think that that's because the regulation's outdated. Other people think because what they're doing is simply like wrongful and should be forbidden. And that's that murky area where you could say it's extremely innovative or it's really, really sketchy.
And AI has to be on the edge of a lot of this, right? I mean, with how they're training the models and LLMs and everything. Tell us about the regulatory risk there, because that's like a real live unfolding in front of us case, right?
Yeah, I mean, easy low-hanging example here. I mean, we all are learning a lot, and it's extraordinary what's being accomplished with some of the Gen AI. But where's all the material coming from? As a lot of the lawsuits are coming out now, I mean, it's being trained on images from Getty. It's being trained on the New York Times articles. I mean, that's required journalists like decades. It's a century of information that was gobbled up over a couple of years effectively for free. Obviously, if you're in an AI company, you're saying the copyright law is outdated and this is general use and it's how we're building the models. Obviously, if you're a photographer and you've made an entire livelihood of taking photos that are being digested now, someone can literally modify and create something new in 6 seconds. You get no proceeds from that. It seems absolutely outrageous. Which side is right here is, I will say, a great example. And obviously, the AI companies are relying on, you could say, a version of regulatory arbitrage. They think the copyright law is simply outdated. And as Gen AI gets enough use, the copyright law will adjust. I don't think a lot of people, let's say the New York Times and Getty, are saying the same thing, though.
Yeah, we're going to talk about how companies make these decisions, but I want to unwind a couple more of the gray areas. One of the favorites for marketers and agency, puffery versus fraud or lying. Tell us about that and the gray area there.
Yeah, I mean, puffery is supposed to be the idea that statements that we all believe to be untrue, they're just a pure form of advertising. Now, it gets interesting when there was a famous oil company that once had an advertisement that said, buy our gas, it's like putting a tiger in your tank.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And I think we can all appreciate that if you go to the gas station, they weren't physically going to take like a live tiger and jam it in your tank. Yep. Okay, that's a good example of puffery. Now, there's another case, and actually, I bought a box. It's amazing what you can get off eBay. It actually a 10-year-old empty cereal box from Kellogg, and on the cover they had of the cereal box, they had boost your immunity. I think it was for Rice Krispies.
Oh yeah.
And I will say the question is, will eating Rice Krispies actually boost your immunity? Yeah, Tiger and the Kink, we kind of all know. Now, boost your immunity, I will say, I mean, I have 2 young kids at home. I mean, they get, like the winter, they get colds. Anything that could get them a little bit less cold, I mean, my wife and I will buy. Yeah. I don't know, maybe that could motivate me. It probably motivated someone. Is that fraud or is that puffery? And I think the world where we operate right now, where information and disinformation, what's real news is fake news, is even more complicated or nuanced. I think that line is even murkier. And a lot of it doesn't look like the tiger. A lot of it looks like really subtle information that's really hard to know the basis of. But this puffery versus fraud, I give one other context. A number of companies have actually been sued in the last several years for making statements, which when investors go back, they look at their code of ethics or code of conduct and say, You literally said you would not do that, and then you engage in that. So it's fraud because you told us you would not do that in your
Right.
code of ethics. And what if companies said, and I appreciate the legal defense here, but it also kind of offends my soul a little bit at the same time, is that companies have then said, well, our code of conduct, our code of ethics is also a puffery. It's not actually
Wow,
something
that's
really.
awesome.
And your reaction is exactly like mine. I mean, I see why. I mean, it's a general statement, but should we really think the code of ethics is like a marketing document? I genuinely hope for all our sake that's not how employees see it and read it.
And are courts upholding that as puffery?
Yeah, I will say they've had success. They've had success with that argument, which again, I find on one hand I can see why, because you're parsing every word in a very technical, legalistic sense, but we can't intuitively see it like that. I mean, I will say that's deeply problematic. I don't know what we're doing in our compliance programs if employees are supposed to see that like a marketing document.
Right. That was okay. Give us a time where the marketer has crossed from puffery into fraud or into lying.
This is well, I'll give someone, I will say, not it's someone in a leadership position. There was a well-known executive at a pharma company named Scott Harkadon. So he was actually the CEO of the company, obviously, but with his other leadership at the company. They were excited about the results from a new trial they had for a disease which had no cure.
Yeah.
And literally they wrote one line about a potential finding that they had, which was a secondary endpoint. It's actually something that actually the government went after, is actually alleging fraud, because they said, hey, patients would see this and actually not draw the subtle statistical conclusion, but instead run out there and try, and it's government fraud. They would run out there and try to get the government to pay 50 grand or whatever the medicine cost, even though it was unproven. They went after with the criminal law after both the leadership of the company around this. I think it's a really interesting example because on one hand, from a commercial side, and you can say all the things the company wants to share in a positive way results for something that could be pretty exciting and actually pretty transformative to people's lives. The question is, how do you share scientific results? And there was actually nothing fraudulent. There was nothing lying or deceptive. But the government alleged because it was placed there, it could convince people in some way that wouldn't read the scientific paper that it was fraudulent.
So the government put it in the context of the user versus the context of the truth of the statement, and looked at the puffery as a lot more than puffery, given the user was desperate for a cure. Is that? I know that's in your book.
Yeah, but well, I guess the question is, how much information are people digesting? There was a study that just came out in the last couple of weeks I read about, that the average person, before they make a decision to buy a stock, the average individual investor spends something on the order of it's like 10 seconds.
Yeah, I was in the Wall Street.
Robinhood,
they spend more time
buy, sell. I mean, it's kind of like a game.
Hamburger. Yeah.
But I mean, on one hand, I would say all the allegations of fraud that one are making against companies, if the average person is only spending 10 seconds making a decision, the best defense a company would have is that the investor hasn't read actually anything about our company. They've read the name and they see the price. They don't even know our business does. I mean, that's obviously a kind of a caricature, a perverse caricature, but people are not digesting the depth of information. Now, the question is, when people digest just little snippets, if they draw the incorrect inference, is that the fault of the company for not laying it out more, or the marketer of not giving it more transparently? Or is that the fault of the consumer or the investor for not, frankly, just taking their time and doing the appropriate due diligence that you would expect? I will say that's what makes this puffery versus fraud distinction so hard. I guess sometimes it's not even clear whose fault, we could say ultimately it is.
So when I'm sitting there in the company, I'm looking at this gray area. How do I even think about it as a company? Like, do I actually understand it, or am I really aware of it? Like, talk about the gray area and how companies should play in it.
Yeah, I mean, there's two areas that I think of. And when I think of all my work, there's both the legalistic and regulatory, and there's also the reputational. I suspect, actually, on a marketing side, I will say, and those two are increasingly closely connected. if you have a lot of reputational scrutiny, that's when regulators or enforcement agencies start looking at you. So actually the reputational test is actually a pretty good first pass to have. If this is on like what I call the TikTok of the world and being traded on LinkedIn is something that's controversial, sure enough, someone else is going to look, is it simply offensive or does it go one step further and it was deceptive?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately from the regulatory enforcement side, they're looking at, was this deceptive? Not just was this offensive. I mean, every year there's always one Super Bowl ad that I don't know what happens because they cost a lot of money and they go through a lot of people's hands. But every year there's always some ad that manages to set the world ablaze for being offending seemingly everyone.
Yeah.
And the question is, well, I mean, where does, I guess that was presumably inside viewed as very edgy. That edginess went so far as to offend people. Generally, it hasn't gone to the deceptive, but actually the crypto companies are pretty interesting here because you have a big star go online, a big football player,
Sure.
a big, someone with a huge following, and they say, I'm buying coin X. Or when those NFTs were all the rage, I'm going to sell you an NFT and it's going to be a big hit. It's going to go up a lot of value. Obviously, why did you buy that thing? Because your influencer is selling it to you, not because they frankly know anything about it. And I think that's where it's starting to get beyond just informing people, which you could say in the best case, what is marketing doing? It's helping inform people about the aspects and the quality of the products and why that's a good fit for them.
Yeah.
It's not trying to trick them into something that's not true about that product.
That's so if I'm sitting there in the company and I'm looking at some of these, because I think the crypto is an excellent one, like Fortune favors the brave, and Curry is selling, is talking about this, and everyone's saying you're gonna miss out if you don't do this. And also I think betting is another area that is really super interesting here in terms of the money back you get from betting, and we'll stake you with this. How do I even see the reputational risk or cliff if I'm in these discussions? And how do I get a good feel for when I'm on the edge and when I'm not on the edge?
Yeah, I'll give you an example that I ran into recently, and I will say this one I will say was so far over the edge. But if someone brought this idea called social gambling, I suspect you and any listeners will. It'll be, I think, New York Times will be writing about this in a couple years. It was presented as take the best parts of crypto, DraftKings, and OnlyFans and put them all together. So you're going to have your favorite influencer, which generally, if it's something like OnlyFans, a lot of times there's a sexual attraction. They're going to run gambling tables like DraftKings and bring you in. So you'll play a game of poker with the influencer, and you'll do this with crypto. Why crypto is useful is when you lose money, because it's crypto, it doesn't actually have the same feeling. It's like, why do you use chips and not dollars? When you lose, it doesn't have that same feeling as losing money. And it was said, we're going to bring this together. I can see how this is going to be a $1 billion business. It's taking like every human instinct and putting it all together. Now, this was a very edgy idea that what I call the gambling companies are even staying away from. The crypto companies that are much more libertarian kind of minded, saying, if you want to spend your money in this way, like, more power to you. It also probably will help circumvent, I suspect, some like money laundering laws, which is where it gets really, really sketchy.
And then Matthew McConaughey will drive up in a Lincoln with a Salesforce tower behind him.
But it's going to make a ton of money, and it will lobby to try to. But I will say this doesn't pass the test where I would say I see in 5 years how we're going to see a pile of like 15-year-olds like on weird sites with like, older people basically that they're attracted to, losing a pile of money gambling. It doesn't pass. Even if you could technically figure out some offshore way to do this legally, I know what that headline is going to look like in 5 years. And I wouldn't want my reputational capital to be even near it. That's an example. It's like, do I want my brand, in this case, it was presented to me as a potential project to work on, anywhere near that? And I would say the answer was no. And I think that's one easy way to start thinking about is, what is the reputational capital? Because reputations are very, very easy to lose. And I think a lot of the, I will say, decisions that I've seen that are described in the book are people that are doing very, very well, and they don't know how to ever say no or ever lose. Sometimes, like, things don't go the way, the business isn't growing. You just need to sometimes, we all have setbacks. People that don't have setbacks, I will say that was Enron. Anytime they had a setback, they found a way of kind of hiding that setback under some special vehicle or some other way because they never wanted to show a loss. Little humility goes a long way.
So, you watch a lot of companies walk right to the edge of the existential risk, where they're going to risk the whole company, and they still take that risk. Sometimes maybe that's the only choice they have, but other times you think, why? And you watch companies like, all the vape companies that ended up selling so much to teenagers and everything. You can kind of look back and see it. Why do they take the risk when they can even see it?
It's something that's, I think, a motivated reason. I mean, I always think, so you asked at the beginning about the teaching. I mean, what case studies are really easy in a classroom, also, frankly, in a corporate training exercise, is because you spend a half an hour debating them. You put the one decision right in front, so it's isolated from the hundreds of other decisions. And you use in a room with people with different views and opinions. In practice, none of those things exist. You have hundreds of decisions in a day. You're making it around people that think like you. And you don't isolate that decision, and you do it fast. So, I mean, you can sit around a room and you can find a lot of ways to justify and kind of rationalize your way into why things are okay. Like, I will say the spirit of people can do what they want with their own bodies. I mean, sitting back, that's I will say, a very well accepted, actually positive statement that the government shouldn't be controlling your body. You can apply that to one context. You can then switch and say, well, let's apply that to vaping. Why should the government tell me that I can't have gummy bear flavored, vapes? Well, I think there might be some good reasons, like your 14-year-old doesn't have a lot of self-control and they're going to get access to that. Maybe that's why we need to actually intervene. But I will say you can step back from that. I'll give an example because I think it's what I see some of my friends that operate in social media. So I've been working on a project now into really kind of, I will say, challenging areas of business. One of those is arms trafficking. So I've spent some time with people that traffic in arms, and what all of them describe their business model is, no one says, I'm moving weapons around to dodgy people. What do they say? I'm in the transportation business.
Yeah.
And I think they genuinely, after decades, say they believe they're in the transportation business. They move something from A to B, and it's not their responsibility. And actually, they're discreet. They're kind of like an old Swiss banker. They don't actually look in people's baggage. That's actually that would be almost impolite to do for their customers or clients. It's that same kind of mentality that can go into a lot of other places when we say we're doing a social media business, and our job is simply just connect one person to another that's friends. And we don't want to put, overly surveil or put restrictions on that. Yeah. That's when you also let a lot of really dodgy people. That's how, someone that's a pedophile that's older starts connecting with a very young kid, because you don't put any restrictions on access and you allow people to take on other identities because you don't want to look into the package. You don't want to look into people's conversations. So I always think the arms dealer logic, I'm just in the business. I've thought about that a lot. Because I genuinely don't think why they're so good at their job. They're not lying to someone else when they say that, because I think they truly have convinced themselves that is actually what they do. Okay. It's the best way of deceiving someone if you don't have to deceive yourself.
Yeah, so don't be a CMO at an arms transportation company.
Join us next week for part 2 of our discussion with Harvard Business School professor Eugene Soltes.
Marketers have been working on personalization since the dawn of the internet, and actually even earlier than that. Now with AI, you can deliver ads made for each of your customers. Publicis Sapient is committed to faster, better personalization and is proud to introduce Slingshot and Bodhi AI. Now these AI platforms are designed to customize every key touch point and reduce creative timelines from weeks to days. With Publicis Sapient, marketing isn't just fast, it's personal. Smarter marketing, happier teams, wow-worthy customer moments. Upgrade your marketing at publicissapient.com.